Hi everybody, this is FIDE Master Dennis Monokroussos, and now we move on in our quick Ruy series to the exchange variation. And hopefully we can just finish this variation in one shot today. So the exchange is a very important line. So of course we've got the Ruy Lopez here with bishop to b5, and we're finally up to a6 now. And then the exchange is with bishop takes c6. And this is really, as I said, a very important line. In part because once white plays bishop to a4, then the ball is really in black's court again. So, it's kind of interesting. I mean, early on there are a lot of options for both sides, and after a certain point, I mean, then the play becomes more standardized, or at least the kinds of structures that arise are more limited, more capable of easily being categorized. They're going to be familiar, and there's going to be a lot of similarity from variation to variation. But here, white has a chance to really change the play from what you'll get in most typical closed Ruy lines. So this really needs to be looked at carefully, and also, of course, it's very popular. A lot of people want to avoid things like the Marshall and the Open, and even to avoid some of the regular closed lines. So bishop takes c6 is a chance for white to really cut back on the amount of theory that he has to know, and it's also a very safe and solid approach. So there's a lot of things that are quite pleasant about it from white's point of view. So black players who play a6, as opposed to the Berlin or the Schliemann, or of course some other opening altogether, really need to know this. Okay, so except for those guys, if you play the regular Ruy, the main lines, this you have to know. All right, so d takes c6. bc is not really a serious move. And here there are at least three moves that have been played, although one is by far dominant. So castling kingside here is by a long way the main line here. But d4 used to be played. I mean, this occurred in the very famous old Lasker-Capablanca game. Essentially, the play is going to be like it will be in many of the castling lines, but in a favorable version for black. So after ed, queen d4, takes. Black can play bishop to d6 here. I think that might have been what Capablanca played, although I'm not sure. Or just bishop to d7, which is the main move. And black's way of playing here is going to be standard in many lines of the exchange. So black will castle long, bring the knight to g6, and generally play f6. And okay, not always, but that's very, very common. The rook might come to the e-file. The bishop comes to c5, or sometimes the pawn comes to c5 with the idea of putting the bishop on c6 and exerting some pressure against e4. Anyway, black is doing fine, and in fact has a plus score in this version of the exchange variation. Okay, let's go back here. Another move that's sometimes played, but again doesn't really do especially well, is knight to c3. Again, black plays f6, d4, takes. Okay, and now neither capture or recapture promises white anything. For instance, queen d4, takes, and now, again, bishop to d6 is possible, but bishop to d7 is quite simple. The thing is, the knight on c3 may not be on its best square, and there's at least no hurry for white to put it there. So again, black's plan is pretty straightforward. He's going to play knight e7, knight g6, castle queenside, put a rook on the e-file, and so on. So for instance, bishop f4, castles, knight e7, and again, knight to g6 is coming next. Even on h4, knight g6, and then h5. And here black will play, I think, bishop to b4, rook h to e8, stick the knight on e5 perhaps. Just a very easy position for black to play. I think this is a Gustafsson game that we're looking at here. Okay, knight takes d4, c5, knight d to e2, queen takes d1. And this is essentially similar to a line with castling. So it's like this line. Castles f6, d4, takes, c5, knight e2, takes. But this is what we're looking at right here is definitely a better version for white than what we've got in this position here. So there's not really any good way for white to recapture. Okay, so this is not really a serious threat. So let's just jump into castles. And here black's got tons and tons of moves, of which I think I'm going to look at 5. Nope, 6. All right, so In brief, we'll look at queen to d6, which I'm not that thrilled about. We'll look at bishop to g4, which is an important line, and is also used as a cheap drawing weapon. Well, I shouldn't say weapon. I mean, it's used when the players have basically pre-agreed to a draw, so it's not that it's a weapon. Bishop to d6. Okay, again, I don't like this line very much either. Knight e7 is a line that's becoming trendy and is quite interesting. Carlsen has been playing this with some regularity. Queen f6 is Gustafsson's recommendation on his DVD, which is very good. Or actually, he has a pair of DVDs, Marshall repertoire, and then one that covers everything leading up to the Marshall. So I like those a lot. But if you don't want to play the Marshall, no need to get it. But it is a very good series. And then finally, the main line, which is f6. Okay, so let's jump in here. So we'll start with queen to d6, which is one way of defending the pawn, although it's not always clear that the pawn needs to be defended. Well, no, the pawn does need to be defended one way or another because now that white is castled, knight takes e5 as a threat. So I guess I should point this out. Knight takes e5 right now is nothing because of queen d4 and then queen takes e2. But of course, if white is already castled, here he's got rook to e1. So that's why black needs to do something about it. Now, queen to d6. All right, so here white plays knight a3, threatening knight c4, again to win the pawn. Black can play b5 here, but the main move at this point, so I'll just note that this exists, and then white plays most of the time c3, and we'll bring the knight back into play via c2. Okay, but bishop to e6 is the main move. Queen e2 reestablishes the threat, and now f6. All right, well, if black is playing f6, you might wonder, well, why not just play that straight away and not bother with queen to d6? Anyway, here white has played 3 moves, and I think they're all quite okay. One is knight to c4, and here black plays queen d7. So again, I just superficially, it's hard to really get the strength of queen d6. Anyway, rook to d1, c5, c3, and bishop to g4 can be played here. But in the game Mamajarov against Svidler, Blitz game in 2009, and other games too, black played b5. And here after knight c takes e5, fe5, knight e5, white has definite compensation for the piece. So he's got 2 nice central pawns and a lead in development, or at least what will be a quick lead in development. So that game continued like this, and here black is already in serious trouble, and Mamajarov went on to win in just 12 more moves from this position. So knight to c4 I think is quite good. Another line is d4, sacrificing a pawn, at least for the moment, and again taking advantage of black's poor development. So often in the exchange Ruy, white is playing for the endgame. He's going to end up with this 4-on-3 kingside majority, while black's queenside majority, because it has this doubled pawn, is tougher to put into action. But occasionally you end up with middle games in the exchange variation, and here, well, as in the last example too, white has some play. Although ironically, this one will turn into an ending. Okay, so here white's up a pawn, and it doesn't look all that meaningful at first, but remember, it's the kingside majority that counts. So white has in fact gone 2.5 out of 3 here. The one draw was with Elyanov, very, very strong Armenian grandmaster, holding on against Gadakamsky in a tournament in Bulgaria in 2010. But as I said, the other 2 games were won by white. Not at that high of a level, but still, very good players. So this is an endgame that white can certainly play and have some hopes in. Okay, and then finally, so we looked at knight c4. That was the Mamajarov-Svidler game. We looked at d4, which was Kamsky-Elyanov. And then there's rook to d1. And, okay, after bishop to g4. All right, if d4, e takes d4, we've transposed back to Kamsky-Elyanov. Black could also castle long, though. So here white generally plays c3. And now, okay, black can either play to prevent d4 in a direct way with c5. Here, though, I think white maybe has an edge. h3, takes, knight e7, and now knight c4 is probably just a nice, simple way for a very small edge, or the more enterprising d4, sacking a pawn, but for very good play. I mean, you can see white has a pretty significant lead in development, some budding queenside pressure, and a move like c6 would be pretty poor on account of knight to c4, or at least very dangerous, threatening knight to b6, threatening knight to d6 check, and on knight to c8 maybe e5. It doesn't look worth it. All right, so instead of c5, then black could play queen e6. Now knight to c2, and this position, in fact, seems to be about equal. So this, I think, is perhaps not white's toughest line, although it's still reasonably interesting. So this occurred in a game, Bashir Lagrave against Fabiano Caruana in Biel in 2010. So I would probably recommend either this knight c4 line with the kind of fun piece sacrifice, or the rook to d1, or sorry, the d4 line, as in Kamsky-Ilyanov. Okay, so let's go back then. So that's queen d6. I don't think that equalizes in most cases. All right, next let's dispense with bishop to d6, because I think this is really a two results line, and neither of those results is black wins. In other words, when you hear someone talk about two result chess, it means that either one side's going to win or it'll be a draw, but the other side is really playing for only a draw. I mean, unless there's a blunder. Now, it's kind of funny that would be the case, because bishop to d6 is the most obvious move that there could be here. I mean, you defend the pawn, you develop a piece, and the bishop won't get in the way of the knight when it goes to e7. The knight won't get in the way of the bishop when it goes to e7. But despite that, this actually gives white very easy play. After d4, e takes d4, there's queen takes d4, and so there's no easy queen exchange now. And after f6, bishop e3, knight e7, knight b to d2. You can see white's development is just very, very natural here. Bishop to e6, and now a nice move. It's well known, but it's still nice. Queen c3, clearing d4 for the knight. So knight g6, knight to d4. Now here, black sometimes plays queen to d7 as opposed to queen to e7. If you take on e6, it's the same thing either way. But on queen d7, f4 is maybe even better for white. So anyway, queen e7, and here a3 is an idea to stop bishop to b4 and to prepare maybe b4, maybe f4, maybe both. But knight e6 is the most usual move. Queen e6, queen b3, takes, castles. And this is an endgame that black never wins unless he's much higher rated than his opponent. In fact, there's something like 20, 25 games with this in the database. Most of the games are drawn, but white has won a fair number, maybe 7 or 8 of those games, and maybe even more than that. And black only won twice. In both cases, there were games between David Howell, and I forget who the other one was. Maybe it was Mark Hebden. But it was when Howell was very young. So, I mean, in the first game, Hebden, I think, outrated him by 400 points. The second game, he outrated him by 200 points and change. And other than those two games, black has no wins in this position. Okay, and the reason, I think, is fairly obvious, or is fairly straightforward. Again, I mean, white has a clean kingside majority. That's one of the big concepts in this exchange Ruy. Black's queenside majority has a doubled pawn, and so there's no way for him to force a passed pawn. If we got to a king and pawn ending, white would just be winning here. Furthermore, black's usual compensation of the bishop here is no longer present, so there's no reason why black should be equal here. It doesn't mean that white's winning, but certainly it's nothing special for black. Black has to just struggle. So bishop to d6 I would definitely not recommend. Okay, next line. Bishop to g4. All right, a lot of games in the database with this are, again, just prearranged draws. And that goes like this: h3, h5, c3. So the idea is to play d4 and grab the center. So black plays queen to d3, stopping it. And I should say, okay, just to address the obvious point, okay, on h takes g4, I don't know if this is a full-fledged blunder or not, but it's certainly not promising, because I mean, after hg4, what do? Knight h2, queen h4, and thanks for playing, good game. Or knight e5, queen h4, push the f pawn, push the g pawn, and splat. So this is really not the way to go. All right, so let's just mates. Okay. Of course, you don't have to play knight h2, but the whole thing makes no sense otherwise. All right, so back to c3. So c3, queen d3, hg, knight e5. And at first glance, this looks like this should be fantastic for white. You're up a piece. The black queen isn't getting to the h-file. What's the problem? Well, black plays bishop to d6. And the standard draw is knight takes d3, bishop h2, followed by bishop back, bishop forward, and so on forever. There's not really any way for white to avoid the draw. If he plays knight takes g4, then knight f6. And what now? If f3, well, then black even wins. Knight takes g4, fg4, queen g3, and the threat is rook h1 check, followed by queen h2 mate. So that's not to be recommended. Another line that's playable is rook to e1, but it doesn't really create a flight square for the king because the queen on d3 covers it. So knight g4, queen g4, bishop h2, and again the bishop's just going to go back and forth unless white wants to lose the game by throwing away his queen. Finally, knight f6 check, g takes f6, again threatening the same thing. And this is actually kind of risky for white, but I think it still is just a draw after rook e1, bishop h2. But if you were to play something like g3, for instance, after bishop takes g3, white can resign. Okay, so all of this to say that this c3 approach is just a draw. That's the only reason white's ever played. Before we get to h5 and then d3, which is an entirely reasonable move, let's talk briefly about bishop to h5, which is actually a very, very sharp and tricky line. And I won't say much about this, but I'll just let you know about it. So after g4, the principled move, I suppose white could play d3. I mean, this is also quite playable and sound, and then white will follow up with bishop to e3 and or knight b to d2. So white can always bail out with this rather than go into something super sharp. But black is doing fine here too. So anyway, g4 is the principled move, bishop g6, and then grabbing the pawn. Here, black has played a couple of moves that are okay. One move that's definitely not okay is bishop takes e4. Here, after rook to e1, black can resign. But bishop to d6 is playable as well. So the main move here is queen to h4. Now queen f3, protecting the h-pawn. f6, takes, and all right, king to g2. And all right, black has some interesting counterplay. The basic idea that black is going to execute. Okay, he'll probably castle first, then play g5, and then swing the knight into g6. From there, it can go to f4 or e5, or the queen retreats and it can go to h4. Naturally, the bishop's probably going to come to d6, and black gets some reasonable play. I mean, white will probably bring the rook to h1, and then get on with his queenside development. Okay, so it's playable. All right, back here. So instead of bishop to h5, let's look at h5, and then d3. And as I said, I mean, white can play like this after bishop h5 as well, though it's maybe not as effective. All right, so here, queen f6, and now white has two good moves. Bishop to e3 will also tend to lead to a pleasant endgame for white. The thing is, after, let's say, bishop takes f3, queen takes f3, queen f3, gf3, and now, for instance, bishop to d6, which is the main move. Okay, sooner or later white might play, well, whether white ends up playing f4 or d4, his kingside majority, well, it's not a majority yet. I mean, if he plays d4, it'll be a majority. If f4, it's not a kingside majority, but a central majority. So one way or the other, I think white ends up with a more comfortable position. So knight to d2, knight e7, and here white has played a bunch of moves. There's knight to c4. And there's even the kind of funny-looking move, rook f to b1. And you might sort of think, okay, are you kidding? What is white going to checkmate black or something? Well, not necessarily, but it's still going to be kind of a minority attack with b4, a4, b5, and with knight c4, knight to b3 coming in. And white seems to have some initiative in these positions. All right, so that's one approach with bishop to e3. There's also knight b to d2, which is, I think, I would consider it the main move between the two, but they're both actually very, very common. All right, so this stops the bishop f3 and doubling white's pawn's plan. knight e7, rook e1, knight g6, d4. And the following long sequence has been played quite often, so we'll just zip through here. So knight f4, and now finally white takes. So it's kind of funny. I mean, after a while you just forget that that bishop is hanging there, but it can on occasion be captured. So hg, hg, but okay, we can't keep it. So g3, g takes f3, queen f3, knight e6, takes, queen takes, knight b3, stopping knight to d4 from black and preparing to bring the bishop out, g6, and now bishop to d2, and certainly white or black cannot take on b2 because bishop to c3 would be rather unpleasant, hitting the queen and the rook in the corner. So c5, now on bishop to c3, in this position, black plays knight to d4. So rook a to d1, rook to d8, same point, bishop c3. Okay, well actually here, yeah, I wanted to more or less stop at this point and say that this occurred in 2 games from the 2010 World Cup between Sergei Karyakin and Alexei Shirov. And Karyakin won both games here. So in the first game he played king to g2. And I don't know if this promises any advantage, but it's a reasonable looking move. Bishop g7, c3, c4, and then he sacrificed a pawn. Well, it's in effect a pawn sack because white can't really afford to take on d4, but on the other hand, the rook is stuck there. So it was an interesting game. Karyakin won. In a later game, he played bishop to c3 here. And after knight to d4, queen g4, I think he stands slightly better, and he went on to win. So just to give the next few moves, it went rook h5, takes, takes, rook d4, takes, takes, and yeah, he didn't play queen takes d4 here because of rook to d1. So that's the little trick here. Queen d4, rook d1, queen moves anywhere to safety. Well, okay, almost anywhere to safety, and then queen d7 is mate. So you can try queen to a4, and let's see what happens here. Well, if nothing else, queen c8 check, king here, queen to d8 check, king here, and then queen takes f8. Maybe there's something even better than this, but this at least seems to be quite all right. Yeah, I should at least make sure I'm not overlooking any ways to give checkmate in one or anything like that. But anyway, so this is what would happen there. So in the game, Shirov just played queen e6, Karyakin traded and won with the extra pawn. So I think this is a comfortable line. So I would say bishop to g4 is again a 2-result variation, unless you try this bishop to h5 thing, which is kind of interesting. But the h5 line, I think, again, it's white wins or white draws. Okay, the next line, knight to e7, is definitely not a 2-result variation. This is kind of this one leads to very, very sharp play. Okay, so white could bail out with something like knight c3 or d3, but then black is just very comfortable. He'll again play knight to g6 and get on with his usual development scheme. So the testing move here is, yeah, so let me just show you. Knight c3, knight g6. Okay, if d4, bishop g1, takes, 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 and now either bishop to b4 or this exchange. In both cases, black is doing well. So really the key move here is knight takes e5. Now, because the e-file is blocked, queen d4 is again playable, and if knight f3, queen takes e4, rook e1 is no big deal. But here the move that's interesting and introduces a lot of sharp play is queen to h5, defending the knight and threatening to take on f7. So g6 is forced, and now white has tried a couple of moves here. And I don't really want to go too much into the theory of this, but again, just to let you know what's going on at least a little bit. Okay, so one move here is knight f3. That's the second most popular move. Queen g5 is the most popular. So knight f3, queen takes e4, and here white has played queen to g5 and queen to a5. Queen a5 is by a long, long way the most popular move, but queen g5 was played by a very strong player, by Arkady Naiditch, in one of those Moscow Blitz events in 2009. So he played this against Leko, and Leko went on to win. So went h6, queen f6, rook g8, knight c3, queen f5. Queen e5, takes, takes, f6, king f7. And here there's no majority for white. So black really doesn't have to worry about endgames at all here. It doesn't have to worry about, exchanges. And so there's the possibility of his bishop here coming into play, and that's indeed what happened. Leka was able to get his bishops going. You can see that the white minor pieces are really restrained here, and black has a space advantage and went on to win actually fairly quickly from here. So after queen takes e4, this queen g5, queen f6 idea doesn't really seem to amount to much. So queen a5 is the main move here. Okay, and now bishop to g4, threatening to take twice on f3, so rook e1, queen d5. All right, and now white has both exchanged and avoided exchanging queens. So these are a couple of Carlsen games. So in a game with his countryman, Jan Ludwig Hammer, Hammer played queen takes c7, and then we had this exchange. And, okay, could have been a draw here. Hammer played queen to g3 instead. And, all right, it was a longer draw, but it was still a draw. So this doesn't seem to be too dangerous for black. In a game, again, with Neidich against Carlsen, again from that same 2009 Blitz event in Moscow, Neidich just immediately made the exchange, hoping, I suppose, for a little bit of activity in return for fixing black's pawns. But Carlsen was able to just grind him down, again, using the bishop pair. So you can look that up in the database. It was a long game. Okay, so anyway, this doesn't seem to be any great shakes for white. So going back here, instead of knight to f3, the main move is queen to g5. And it looks very precarious. I mean, both sides in some ways seem to have a bad position here. But anyway, we'll see. There's awkwardness, but it makes it very complicated and very interesting. All right, bishop to g7, hitting the knight again, knight to d3. And now the point of putting the knight on d3 rather than on f3 is that after, for instance, queen takes e4, which probably deserves some question marks, there's rook to e1. And the knight on d3 prevents queen to b4, protecting it. So maybe black isn't losing yet because of f6, but it's not a good position for him either. Okay, so f5 is the move. And this looks really insane. I mean, what in the world is black doing? He's opening the e-file against his own king. And here white doesn't even take it. He doesn't even play e takes f5. Well, the reason is that if he does take it, it's really allowing black very speedy development. And there's no real threat, because after e takes f5, bishop takes f5, rook e1, there's bishop to f6, blocking it with tempo, and then black can castle, and his development is fantastic. So e5 is the move here. All right, and now, okay, black plays c5 most of the time. There are other moves like queen to g4 too, though. But c5, and now just to show a little bit of one recent game, b3. And here the main moves are b6 and h6. But once again, no less a player than Magnus Carlsen chose a different way. He played queen to g4 against Fabiano Caruana in last year's, in the 2010 Moscow Blitz. So Caruana swapped and played knight takes c5. He's up 2 pawns. Queens are off the board. What could happen that's bad? Well, b6, knight d3, bishop f5, bishop b2, takes, castles long, and certainly black has very good compensation for the pawns, or really for the pawn, because the d-pawn, the frontmost d-pawn is dropping. Because of d4, there's knight f5. So, in fact, Caruana lost badly, but actually I think he was all right, and I think he missed a tactic later, but black was always fine too. So this line with knight to e7 is really quite interesting. And again, it breaks the mold. I mean, so it's not one of these lines where white is going to play for, or is always going to have the draw in his pocket for whenever he wants it. So here, real chess has to be played. Okay, next line, queen f6. So this is Gustafsson's recommendation on the DVD, and I'll mention some of the highlights in his coverage. So d4, e takes d4, bishop g5, queen d6. And, okay, again, if queen takes d4, this is basically the same kind of thing we saw before. You trade, you play bishop to d7, and then, as always, f6, castle queenside, knight comes to g6, you stick a rook on the e-file, and so on. So knight takes d4, bishop d7, knight c3, bishop to e7, and here white can choose between taking on e7 or retreating the bishop, and they're both important lines. On bishop takes e7, knight e7, Gustafsson mentions a couple of possibilities here. So one from Rajabov against Michael Adams in Baku in 2008 is knight d to e2. And here Adams just castles, queen c1, knight g6, queen e3, threatening to jump into a7, so king over, rook a to d1, queen e7. And here, well, I would say what Gustafsson recommends, but it's just, in fact, what Adams did in the game. So he puts the bishop on c8, trades one pair of rooks, but not both, because you can use the second one for other purposes, and put the knight on e5, play f6, h5, g5, and so on, which is what Adams did. So let's just quickly look through the game. Okay, b3, stopping knight c4, excuse me, bishop c8, rook here, trades, and now f6. So again, solidifying the e5 square. So it's not just about, well, I mean, it's primarily about that. So you're grasping for the e5 square, and you're trying to slow down the advance of white's majority. f3, h5, rook d1, and now g5. So he just creates this blockade on the king side, and he's fine. So now white doesn't even have a majority any longer. So this is just not going anywhere. And they just repeated moves like this. Okay, so that's a nice convincing demonstration of how black can hold the position without any real difficulty. All right, another move for white is knight to b3, which is a bit more enterprising, hoping to bring the knight to a5 or maybe in some cases to c5. So from here, black has played a couple of different moves. Carlsen castled queenside here, but this is actually one of his unsuccessful efforts against the exchange variation. So here, this is again from the last year's Moscow Blitz in 2010 against Vashir Lagrave, and he lost this game. He slowly got ground down in this ending. So here, white has his clean majority, and again, he was able to eventually grind out the point. So it's interesting, though, that Carlsen castled. I don't know if he felt there was a problem with what he played in an earlier game or not, or maybe he just ignored the possibility of the queen trade, or of white avoiding the queen trade, or at least avoiding that queen trade. So anyway, in an earlier game, and I think, yeah, actually in a slow game against Peter Lecko, he had traded queens directly earlier, and then played b6, the stop knight to d5, and knight a5 for that matter. Rook d2, castles, rook f to d1, c5, knight d5, and now a very neat little sequence by Carlsen. Trades, and then f5, taking advantage of the fact that on e takes f5, bishop f5, of course, rook f5 walks into mate. Also going back here, I should say, if e5, bishop to e6 is just fine for black. The e5 pawn is going nowhere. So the game was like this, okay, and they just traded all the rooks. And normally this would be thought to be a superior ending for white, but in fact his knight's not very good here. So it's poorly placed. Black is active enough. So even here, black didn't have any real problems. He was able to activate his king quite quickly. And in fact, it was white who had to be a little bit more careful to make sure he held the draw. Okay, so a3 fixes the pawns. I mean, it prevents black from making any passers, but it also means that with the black king all the way up here on c4, white can't ever activate, because otherwise king b3 and bad things happen. Yeah, here if king to b3, king c1, and white just sits, but they just repeated and agree to a draw. So this is a solid line. It's not as sharp as knight e7, certainly on move 5. Okay, so anyway, that was all stuff with bishop takes e7. And there's also bishop to e3. On this, black castles. And from here, the plan is to play the knight to h6, not f6. And that leaves g6 free for the queen, f6 clear for the bishop, and keeps f5 as a possibility. So here it's not an f6 variation for a change. And that's in part because the bishop on e7 kind of thwarts the usual smooth development that black would enjoy in most of those lines. So here black is playing more aggressively. All right, for instance, f4, knight h6, and now if h3, then c5. If f5, then bishop f6 with play on the dark squares. And if instead of f4, queen e2, then knight h6. Okay, if h3, then queen to g6. And if f3, then f5. Okay, so that's all Gustafsson analysis there of this bishop e3, bishop to e7, or sorry, bishop e7, bishop e3 stuff. Okay, so that's Gustafsson's pet line with queen f6. Again, if white goes for the bishop exchange, though, that seems to be fairly dry. All right, finally, another dry line is f6, although I think white has some decent chances here. So d4, e takes d4, knight d4, c5. Now the old-fashioned line here is with knight to b3. I mean, Fischer played this in a number of games, and it's been seen many times. And it's still an important move, but it's been superseded really by knight to e2. So about knight to b3. So here swap, and then this little finesse with bishop to g4 is an important trick, and this really helped to push this line out of business. So the idea is that after f3, bishop e6, and now, for instance, let's say knight c3, then there's c4, and then bishop to c5. And thanks to this pin, black gets some time to complete his development in a really ideal fashion. Okay, on bishop to e3, probably simplest now is just to trade and play knight e7. And here with the opposite colored bishops, black is very solid. Okay, another try for white is bishop to f4. Again on this, c4, and now we take advantage of a different pin with castle and queenside. And on knight c3, bishop f7. Again, black is perfectly okay here. Okay, and then I think the main move here would be bishop to e3. So now c4 is not as effective. All right, on this, black plays b6. Okay, a4. And this a4 resource is actually a very important one. So anyone who plays the exchange, well, on either side, really ought to know about this. And it's a similar idea in the Rossolimo Sicilian as well, because black has a similar pawn structure there. White wants to play a5 and kind of break things up. And if black plays a5, well, then you're weakening b5 and c4. So it's an important idea. But black is okay. Anyway, from here, after king f7, white can play knight c3 or a5 or bishop to f4. And all of these lines have their importance. But I'm just going to let you know about it, but leave that for further research. I mean, there's already enough stuff here. Okay, so as I said, knight e2 I think is a bit more fashionable at the moment. So takes again, and and one point with the knight on e2. Well, 2 points. I mean, one is that there's not going to be any tempi for black to gain with c4. Here, c4 would be just a ridiculous move. And also the knight can sometimes jump to f4 and then hopefully in some cases go to d5 or to some other useful location. Whereas on b3 there's nothing for the knight to do unless it can jump into a5 at some moment. So bishop to d7, knight b to c3 in castles, bishop e3, rook e8. Again, very familiar kinds of play from black. All right, now rook to d2, bishop c6, rook a to d1. Of course, black can't take on e4 because knight e4, rook to e8 is mate. So b6, and now, okay, by the way, I should say, black still is not threatening to take on e4 because knight e4, rook to e8, and then rook takes f8. So b6 does give the king a little cubby hole, and you can see, I mean, in some ways this looks like a Berlin. I mean, it's significantly different with the pawn on e4 rather than on e5, but there are still a number of factors that are quite Berlin-like. Anyway, from here, there are 3 main moves for white. So we can play knight f4, again, aiming to put a knight on d5. But also, maybe if the bishop comes out to d6, knight to h5 could be kind of annoying. That'll make some weaknesses in the black king side, or at least it's trying to induce some weaknesses. Another reasonable move is f3, just cutting out any tricks against the e4 pawn. Although when you play f3 here with that loose bishop on e3, you have to worry about f5 possibilities. Although maybe not just yet, but they can be in the air. And then finally, and this scores the best, and it's becoming, I think, a popular move, a4. And Radjabov played this in 2008, but actually some other people played it earlier than that. I think Meyer, the strong German grandmaster, although maybe he was an IM at the time, played this in 2007. And again, it's becoming an important move. The idea, of course, again, is to play for a5. And again, if black plays a5, he's weakening the light squares on the queen side somewhat, and also making it harder for him to activate his majority. Also, if he can't push these queenside pawns, the dark squared bishop, black's dark squared bishop, may never really come into the game either. So this is an interesting try. Maybe white has some pull here. And anyway, a lot of different ways for black to play, as you can see. I would suggest if you want to go for sharper play, the way to go is either with, let me get all the way back here. Yeah, so either play bishop g4, h3, bishop h5. Although again, maybe you'll have to see if you can drum up anything interesting against d3, or whether that'll end up being a similar version of the endgame that we have here with d3. So that's one way, and then most definitely after castles, knight e7 is certainly leading to complicated play. And even the endings there are ones where black doesn't have to fight against a white kingside majority. So these two lines are I think, where the most exciting action is taking place. But most of these lines are very, very solid for black. So, it's a matter of taste. If you like to play solid chess, you like to play endings, you're not afraid of the ending at all, then you have a wide variety of options. But if you're looking to, you don't want to try to grind out your opponent in 60 moves, and you want to keep the play lively, then I think, again, knight e7 is absolutely a way to go, or even maybe that bishop to g4 line. Okay, so with that, we will put the exchange variation to bed, at least the regular exchange. I mean, there are also deferred variations we will need to take at least a brief look at later on. So I guess next time we'll hit bishop to a4 and then look at some sidelines after that. All right, thanks a lot. See you next time. Bye-bye.